Hi students, welcome to this chapter on human digestion and absorption. A little bit of review from your first anatomy and physiology class, just to remind you that from a scientific perspective, the human body is organized from tiniest level to the level of the organism. We can study it at a chemical level. We can study it at the cellular level. We can consider it from the level of a tissue being similar cells that come together for a similar function. We can look at it from the organ level, so several kinds of tissue, muscle tissue, nerve tissues, endothelial tissues will come together to make an organ, for example, like the stomach. And then a lot of what this chapter in reality is a look at the digestive and absorptive organ system. So we're going to see several organs, the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestine, just to name a few, that come together to make up a system. Now, there's quite a few systems, but when we put the systems together, we have the organism, or in this case, the human being, or how do we deal it with digestion and absorption for you and for me. So the epithelial tissues are tissues that cover the surfaces inside and outside of the body. So we're going to see a lot of unique epithelial tissues as we move through the digestive system. The body is also full of connective tissue, and just as its name suggests, these are the tissues that support and essentially hold body structures together. Muscles contract and relax. Muscles always work by contracting or shortening, and in that way they allow movement. We're going to see that we have both voluntary and involuntary muscles. Our digestive system has both kinds, but probably the bulk of its work is done by autonomic or involuntary muscle, and we don't even have to think about the fact that all of these incredible movements are going on. It's controlled for us. And of course, the control is coming from nervous tissues. So as we talk about the digestive system, we will consider the organs of the gastrointestinal tract, the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. There are some accessory organs. The liver goes here. The pancreas is what you would put into this blank spot in your slides. And we also have the gallbladder. So here again, we have this nice diagram of the digestive system. The flow of the GI tract begins in the mouth. In the mouth, we have voluntary control of the nerves and muscles, at least in the beginning of a swallow. But there's a point that after we have moved our bolus of food through and towards the back of the oral cavity, that involuntary muscle movements will take over, and we'll see that it will be involuntary muscle movements that will move our bolus of food down the esophagus. So the esophagus is a pipe-like organ connecting the oral cavity to the stomach. In the average person, it's about 10 inches long. The esophagus will empty into the stomach. The stomach is an empty pouch. At rest, it typically will hold about 4 cups or a liter. It is quite stretchy, and if you ask it to, it will probably stretch to accommodate nearly 4 times that amount, or approximately a gallon. So it depends a great deal on what you have eaten, but a mixed meal will probably typically stay in your stomach for 2 or 3 hours, longer if it's a high fat or a very, very large meal. But when your stomach is done doing its particular job on the food that you have eaten, it will slowly contract and squirt its contents into the small intestine. So the small intestine joins the stomach, and it's actually the mass of coiled up tubes labeled as number 7 in the diagram. The small intestine is divided into 3 sections, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum is considered to be about 10 inches to 12 inches in length. The next section is the jejunum. It's about 4 feet long. And then the final section, the ileum, is about 5 feet long. Now, the food that you have consumed that will have spent time in your stomach will be squirted into the small intestine. And this is where most digestion and absorption will take place. And again, depending on what you've consumed, it's probably 3 to 10 hours for this food to pass through your small intestine. The last major organ is the large intestine, also referred to as the colon. The colon is not as large, but its diameter is wider, and so it picks up the name colon. Right here, dangling from the colon, we have an apparently useless dead-end passage called the appendix. And we see that the small intestine will join the colon right here in this area called the cecum, and the colon will ascend or go up. It will go across the abdominal cavity, and this is referred to as the transverse colon for going across. It will now descend, and the next couple of feet are referred to as the descending colon. Finally, this will end in 2 passages and an opening to the outside of the body called the rectum and the anus. How long will something stay in your colon or your large intestine? It may only stay there a few hours, but it's also very typical for food to move rather sluggishly, or I should say the remains of food, to move rather sluggishly through the colon or large intestine. And so it's possible that items will stay in here for 72 hours or several days. Now, the passage of what started as your food and will eventually end up as fecal material is controlled through the digestive tract by some circular muscular valves that we call sphincters. There is a sphincter valve at the bottom of the esophagus. So it is between the esophagus and the stomach. Now, your mouth is actually a sphincter valve. So kind of think of it as round and circular, and it has the ability to open as well as to close quite tightly. So the purpose of the lower esophageal sphincter is to open and let contents from the esophagus enter the stomach. It will stay closed when there is nothing pressing down on it from the oral cavity, because the stomach has some very, very acidic juices, and we don't want those juices getting back up into the esophagus. There is a pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter is between the stomach and the small intestine. When what used to be your food has spent adequate time digesting in the stomach, the pyloric sphincter will get the message, and that message will be received both from nerves and from hormones. And this will control the flow of stomach contents into the small intestine. There's a very small sphincter called the hepatopancreatic sphincter that will control the flow of bile and pancreatic juices from the common bile duct and into the small intestine. So bile from the liver and juices from the pancreas will be released into the small intestine when chyme or the remains of your meal is present. And those substances will chemically help a great deal with the digestion of the food substances that are in your chyme. When the chyme has made its way through the small intestine, again, a 3 to 10 hour passage, there is a valve between the small and the large intestine. It's called the ileocecal valve, and that makes a great deal of sense because the end of the small intestine is the ileum, and the beginning of the colon or large intestine is the cecum. So again, this sphincter-like valve exists to prevent the contents of the large intestine from entering and flowing backward into the small intestine. Now, in the anal passageway, there again are actually two sphincters. You can see the rectum sphincter on the outside of your body, but there's an inner sphincter also. The inner sphincter is controlled by autonomic nerves, and when enough weight presses down on it, it will open and allow fecal material to flow into the anal canal. You do have, hopefully, you have voluntary control of the final sphincter in your digestive system, but it takes a while for that to happen. We know that infants, it's probably a 2.5 to 3 year plus process to train that particular sphincter. If you're interested in some video on the digestive system, I have two current links to YouTube. These are animated as well as a lot of really fascinating photography. They are less than 10 minutes each, so spend a little bit of time and be fascinated with this fascinating system. So overall, there are two primary functions that take place in the digestive system. Digestion is the process of breaking food from whole food into a chemical that is small enough that it will be able to pass through the digestive system and get inside the body. The actual passing through of the nutrient is referred to as absorption. Absorption is the uptake of nutrients from the digestive system into either your bloodstream or your lymph. This is a pretty incredible digestive system. We will start with something like, a whole apple or a sandwich, and we will really in a matter of hours wind up with chemicals that are small enough that they actually can be carried in your bloodstream. So this is incredibly efficient and incredibly effective. We talk a little bit about the entryway to the digestive system. It's the mouth and the oral cavity. Chewing and using our teeth helps us to pulverize and mash up the food that we consume. As we do this, we increase the surface area, and our food becomes mixed with saliva, and this moistens it. We're also going to find that the saliva does contain lysozymes, which are substances that will help to break down bacteria which might be on our food. This again will protect us from infection by this bacteria. There are mucuses to lubricate and kind of bind and hold this bolus together. And there are enzymes that are found in saliva. One of the most prevalent ones is called amylase. Now, enzymes always end, the word for an enzyme or the term for a specific enzyme always ends in ASE. But generally, the first part of the word will tell you what substance is going to be broken down by the enzyme. So amylase is going to break down a very common food starch that is called amylose. The esophagus moves the bolus from the mouth to it entertains the swallowing muscular motions and will allow the bolus of food that you have swallowed to move to the esophagus. There is a structure called the epiglottis, a little flap of skin that will close over your trachea, and it will prevent food from lodging in the trachea and the and thereby getting into your lungs. So this will cover up the larynx and block food from getting in the trachea. Okay, very nice kind of diagram showing you how this yellow bolus of food gets kind of voluntarily pushed by the tongue back against the hard palate and then begins to move towards the back of the oral cavity, towards the pharynx. Here you see we've started the swallowing process and the bolus is now in an involuntary muscle movement. You kind of lost control and swallowing is going ahead. The bolus is going to flip the epiglottis down, and as the epiglottis is flipped down, it is going to cover up the larynx or the voice box, and this is the passageway to the trachea and to the lungs. Here in one of the final stages of swallowing, we see that the bolus has passed. The epiglottis is able to open up, and now we can talk again, and now we can breathe and get air into our lungs. But actually in the second stage, when the epiglottis is closed, we will not be able to talk at that particular instant, and we will not be able to breathe. Here are two videos that will take you through the process of swallowing. It's actually a complicated series of muscle and nerve interactions, and we do see that it is disrupted when people suffer from nerve damage. So in a time when we often see issues with swallowing, for example, is following a stroke when there has been some nerve damage associated with the brain. Okay, well, the bolus has moved through the esophagus and it is now pressing against the lower esophageal sphincter. Simply the weight of the food or the drink will be enough to get the lower esophageal sphincter to open, and our bolus will move into the stomach. It will now mix with the acids and the secretions of the stomach, and we should officially at this point no longer call it your food, but refer to it as chyme. Again, how long will this food item stay in your stomach? May move through fairly quickly if it is simply waters and sugars, but if it has protein or fat, it's going to stay in your stomach for several hours. When your stomach is done processing the chyme, the sphincter between stomach and small intestine will open gradually. And it will squirt tiny amounts, about a teaspoon or so of chyme into the small intestine. It will not open and dump the entire amount into your small intestine. That's really too much for your small intestine to handle. So its job is to open squirt about a teaspoon into the small intestine, close and pause a few seconds, and then repeat this until the stomach has a chance to empty. There actually is a little hormone here called gastric inhibitory peptide. Gastric inhibitory peptide is secreted by the digestive system, and it will slow the release of chyme into the small intestine. So for example, if I have a very big meal in my stomach or a very, very high fat meal, and the stomach is saying, I need more time than usual, it will respond by making this hormone that will actually slow down the release of the chyme into the small intestine. Generally takes 1 to 4 hours for a mixed meal to move out of the stomach, and 20% of alcohol is absorbed in the stomach. Now, that's interesting because nothing else is absorbed from the stomach. It's going to go on into the small intestine. So this means that 20% or a fifth of your alcohol consumption will actually hit your bloodstream once it is in the stomach. So alcohol can get into the bloodstream far more quickly than other nutrients can. I've been alluding to the fact that the stomach makes a lot of acid, but it does make a very, very strong acid called hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid will inactivate salivary enzymes like the amylase. It's a very important tool in our immune system because it destroys bacteria and viruses. And the presence of this acid will ultimately benefit and help us to be better absorbers of minerals like calcium and iron. The stomach also secretes a substance called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen will be converted into the active enzyme form pepsin, which digests proteins. What's interesting is the wall of the stomach is actually muscle and protein itself. So pepsin can digest the stomach wall itself. So what the stomach does is it secretes an inactive version, pepsinogen, and once the pepsinogen meets the hydrochloric acid in the lumen or the opening of the stomach, it is then converted to its active form. And that way it keeps the pepsin away from the walls of the stomach if things work the way they're supposed to. So in the first blank, you want to put in inactivates salivary enzymes. In the second one, you would put in with the help of hydrochloric acid. The third one is a reference to another hormone of digestion called gastrin. Gastrin is the hormone that will stimulate the stomach to release its hydrochloric acid and its pepsinogen. So I shouldn't normally be releasing gastrin until the point in time where I'm eating. And I eat, my stomach gets the message to release the gastrin, and the gastrin actually will stimulate the stomach to go ahead and release hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. Okay, nice little diagram of the lining of the stomach. So up here, we have the lumen. The lumen is kind of the central opening of the stomach. This is where your chyme or the remnants of the food you ate would be. Now, the stomach has a very, very thick mucus layer that is over its muscles and its epithelial tissues and so forth. And within the mucus layer, we have these gastric pits that are lined with glands. So the chief cells and the parietal cells are responsible for the production of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, but they don't release them and they do not become active until they are on the other side of these mucus cells. So the chemicals that would digest the stomach, again, tend to be limited to this protective mucus layer and the lumen of the stomach. Of course, occasionally this doesn't work as we would like it to do, and then we'll have an ulcer that will result. Just to remind you, the acid of the stomach, the hydrochloric acid, is considered to be a strong acid. On the spectrum of things, if human blood and pure water has a pH of 7, hydrochloric acid can go as low as 1 to 0, and the gastric juices that we secrete tend to run 0.9 to 3. Lemon juice is kind of similar to the acid at its more neutral or higher levels. So remember that when we talk about pH, the lower the acid goes, the stronger the acid is and the more hydrogens that actually are released. So remember, this is a very strong acid. Okay, the chief cells of the stomach also release an enzyme that will do a bit of work on lipids. This is called gastric lipase. The mucus is secreted to prevent the stomach from being digested. And then the stomach is also known for the production of intrinsic factor, which will be required for the absorption of vitamin B12. So would you go ahead and put B12 in this blank? So the stomach is really known for starting digestion. It especially digests and begins the chemical breakdown of proteins. And there'll be a bit of lipid digestion that takes place, but again, the stomach known for its role in the digestion of proteins from the food that you have consumed. And it will keep the chyme in your stomach as long as is needed to start that initial breakdown of proteins into smaller pieces and fragments that will enter the small intestine for the final completion. Okay, so that is the end of section 1. Bear with me and we will get to section 2 as soon as possible.